There are names in the dusty pages of history whose lives, thoughts, and even silences transcend ages and reach us today. Socrates is one of the brightest among these names. This man, who became the symbol of being a philosopher among philosophers, fundamentally changed the course of philosophy despite leaving behind not a single written work. In the 5th century BCE, this man, walking with his sandals through the narrow streets of Athens, would upset people's minds by asking simple questions: what is virtue? Logically, what is justice? Swing, can we reach true knowledge? These questions were not only philosophical, they were also a deep social critique and a call for individual transformation. Socrates brought philosophy down from abstract thought into the streets. The period in which Socrates lived is known as the Golden Age of ancient Greece. Athens, where he was born in 469 BCE, was experiencing a great rise in both art and politics. He lived in a city where the Parthenon was being built, tragedy plays were staged, and democracy was flourishing. However, this brilliance also contained deep conflicts, class divisions, wars, and philosophical disagreements. Athens had emerged victorious from the Persian Wars and was living under the shadow of the Peloponnesian Wars. Democracy was developing, but at the same time it faced the dangers of populism. It was in such an environment that Socrates initiated an intellectual revolution. He became a philosopher who appealed not only to the individual soul, but also to the conscience of society. Most of our knowledge about Socrates has come down to us through the dialogues of his student Plato. He was considered physically ugly. His large nose, short stature, and disregard for clothing went against society's aesthetic understanding. But his real charm lay in the intelligence, consistency, and stubbornly questioning method of his conversations. Legend has it that he would wake up early in the mornings and start talking to young people, merchants, and artists in the city square or the agora. He never took money or gave lessons. He was a lover of wisdom, literally a philosopher. Why Socrates left no written works? Socrates left no written works. Several reasons are thought to explain this. Adherence to oral tradition. Socrates believed that philosophy should be learned through one-on-one dialogue, through living intellectual struggle. Written texts, in his eyes, were static and unidirectional. Beliefs. According to Socrates, writing freezes the soul of knowledge. True knowledge, on the other hand, is something that is in constant questioning, dialogue, and change. Modesty. For someone who claimed to possess no knowledge, leaving a written doctrine would have contradicted his own ethical teachings. For these reasons, Socrates' life was shaped not by philosophical texts, but by the observations and writings of his students. Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes are the most important sources of information about him. However, it should be noted that these sources are also biased. Plato presents his teacher as a saint, while Aristophanes ridicules him in his play The Clouds. Socrates' philosophy. Socrates' philosophy was built on the principle of knowing oneself. Know thyself, gnoti sauten, is his most frequently cited maxim. According to him, true knowledge begins with the realization of one's own ignorance. Concepts such as morality, virtue, justice, and wisdom constantly appear in Socrates' discussions. These topics are central to his philosophical life. Virtue. Can virtue be taught? Knowledge. What is the difference between knowing and believing? justice. Is justice what is advantageous to the stronger? Health of the soul. What should be the relationship between the desires of the self and the virtuous aspect of the soul? These questions have become not only Socrates' most fundamental questions, but also those of the history of philosophy. Socrates in Athenian society. Socrates was a figure both loved and resented among the people of Athens. The aspect that bothered people was his questioning of their beliefs and thoughts. His relationship with young people, in particular, was seen as a threat by older generations. Socrates was never a political leader or a teacher. For him, the most important thing was the spiritual development of the individual. Asking questions, making people think, and questioning the foundations of ideas was his way of teaching. Because of this approach, he gradually drew the reaction of the ruling class and conservative circles. Socrates' trial and eventual execution can be interpreted not only as a personal tragedy, but also as a historical attack on freedom of thought. The charges brought against him were corrupting the youth, not believing in the gods of the state, inventing new gods. These accusations were, in fact, a reflection of the fear felt towards his anti-establishment ideas. Socrates challenged death, did not give up his ideas, and died by drinking hemlock. This is deeply significant, as he was one of the first great figures in history to die for the sake of thought. Youth and education, birth and family. Socrates was born in 469 BCE in Athens, one of the most brilliant cities of ancient Greece. His family was neither noble nor completely ordinary within Athenian society. They were a middle-class family. His father, Sophroniskes, was a sculptor, and his mother, Phaenarete, was a midwife. These two professions would become deep symbols in his character. Socrates' father, being a sculptor, taught him the meaning of creating something with his hands in childhood. His mother, on the other hand, was a patient and attentive woman who accompanied new lives. It was no coincidence that in later years he saw himself both as a shaper of souls, a symbol of his father, and as a midwife helping the birth of truth, a symbol of his mother. Early education. In ancient Greece, children were educated differently according to their family's economic status. Socrates' family sent him to a teacher to learn reading and writing and to develop in basic areas such as music and poetry. Young Socrates' particular interest in Homeric epics was striking. It is said that he could recite parts of the Iliad and the Odyssey by heart, and had a deep interest in heroic stories. During these periods, education included music, mathematics, physical education, rhetoric, and the foundations of philosophical thinking. Socrates' early interest in poetry, and especially music, shows that not only his intellect, but also his emotional side developed. Physical prowess. Socrates had an athletic build in his youth. Sports were very important for Athenian youth at that time. Socrates was particularly interested in wrestling and participated in several competitions in his youth. This physical discipline may have also nourished his mental resilience. Even in later years, his walks in harsh weather conditions and his long periods of deep thought show how much he cared about his physical health. This aspect of his life is recounted by Plato in his Symposium dialogue. On a cold winter day, Socrates is walking outside barefoot without getting cold, surprising those around him. This shows that he possessed an unusual strength, both physically and spiritually. Apprenticeship as a sculptor. In his youth, He learned his father's profession and worked as a sculptor for a while. According to some sources, sculptures made by Socrates were exhibited in temples in Athens for a long time. One of the most frequently mentioned is a sculpture of the Three Graces. This art may have reinforced his patience, meticulousness, and interest in the concept of form. Perhaps in later years, Socrates' thoughts on form and essence played a decisive role in Plato's formation of the theory of forms. Looking beyond form was possible not only in sculpture, but also in the human soul. Intellectual influences. Although we do not have definite sources about Socrates' early intellectual education, it is clear that he was influenced by certain thinkers. Anaxagoras. This thinker, considered the last of the pre-Socratic natural philosophers, tried to explain the order in the universe with nous, mind. This concept may have coincided with Socrates' understanding of moral reason. Followers of Pythagoras, ideas on the immortality of the soul, moral life, and universal order resonated in Socrates' thinking. Sophists. The rhetorical techniques and approach to knowledge of sophists, like Gorgias and Protagoras, were both an inspiration and a source of criticism for Socrates. However, Socrates quickly diverged from this intellectual tradition and took a different direction. He tried to understand humanity, not nature, the soul, not objects in the universe, society, not the heavens. In this respect, he clearly differs from the philosophers who preceded him. Military service. As a requirement of being an Athenian citizen, Socrates participated in 3 wars: Potidaea, Delium, and Amphipolis. The courage he displayed in these wars showed him to be not only a thinker, but also a person of moral conviction. According to Plato, Socrates walked fearlessly on battlefields and protected his friends from danger when necessary. Alcibiades' laudatory words in the Symposium, in particular, show that he acted rationally and calmly, even in war. Realization of ignorance. What Socrates realized at an early age was how superficial people's thoughts were on subjects they presumed to know. At a young age, he began talking to merchants, politicians, and poets in the agora, cornering them with simple questions and making them realize their own ignorance. During this period, he made a decision within himself. The first step to reaching true knowledge is to accept your ignorance. This maxim would become the touchstone of both his life and his philosophy. Family life. Not much information is available about Socrates' relationship with his family. However, it is thought that in his youth he was a respectful individual, loyal to traditions, but that over time his philosophical interests led him to prioritize traditional expectations less. It is known that he was married and had several children. It is often recounted that his wife, Xanthippe, was ill-tempered and that Socrates endured trials of patience in this marriage. However, it is also thought that most of these anecdotes contain humorous or fabricated elements. The Socratic method. Socrates is considered a revolutionary in philosophical method. The natural philosophers who preceded him tried to explain the origin of the universe, the structure of matter, and the laws of nature. But Socrates' perspective was very different. To know man is more important than to know the universe. For this reason, Socrates directed philosophy from nature to man, to the individual's inner world and morality. The method he developed while doing this, although seemingly simple question and answer, contains a deep intellectual structure, the Socratic method, or in other words, elenchus. Elenchus in ancient Greek means refutation or interrogation. This method aims to reveal inconsistencies in the other person's thoughts. Socrates, in response to any claim, first asks questions to the other person to clarify their view. Then, to test this view, he asks new questions that create contradictions. What is elenchus? This method works in 3 stages. Demand for a definition. He asks a question like, what is virtue? Elaboration of the concept. The other party answers, for example, virtue is courage. Confrontation with contradiction. Socrates tests the limits of the answer with a question like, well, is taking unnecessary risks also courage? As a result, the person's answer contradicts itself, and the person unconsciously admits their ignorance. Socrates' method aims to eliminate false knowledge rather than to provide knowledge, because according to him, man's greatest enemy is not ignorance, but false knowledge. That is, thinking one knows, but actually not knowing. For this reason, Socrates' most famous saying is, "The only thing I know is that I know nothing." This statement is not modesty, but a call for deep intellectual discipline. The knowing person questions, doubts, and stays away from absolute truths. Socrates wants to bring the individual to this level of awareness. The Maieutic method, midwifery. Socrates' mother was a midwife. He himself said that he was a midwife in a philosophical sense, delivering correct thoughts from people's minds. This approach is called the Maieutic method, from the Greek maieutikos, pertaining to midwifery. With this method, Socrates does not provide knowledge like a teacher. On the contrary, he helps the other person bring out the potential knowledge that they already possess within themselves. People reach knowledge by questioning their own thoughts. This is based on the understanding that the student, not the teacher, should be active. Structure of Socratic dialogues. When Plato's dialogues are examined, the following structure is generally observed. Socrates begins to speak in a meeting or discussion setting. He asks the other person about a concept, e.g., what is justice? The other party answers, and Socrates tests that answer. The answer is refuted or found insufficient. New answers are attempted, but problems arise again. Ultimately, the conversation often ends without reaching a definitive definition. This method of Socrates often led to conflict with sophists, politicians, and self-proclaimed scholars, because questioning everything they knew humiliated them and made them subjects of ridicule. For this reason, Socrates was seen as sarcastic, malicious, or someone who corrupted the youth. However, his purpose was not personal but philosophical, to reach true knowledge. Contemporary relevance. The Socratic method is today considered one of the foundations of modern educational philosophy. It is particularly effective in the following areas. Legal education. In American law schools, students are encouraged to learn through interrogation by being placed in the position of a judge or prosecutor. Psychology. In therapies, the aim is for the individual to find their own answers. Ethical discussions. In controversial topics like virtue and morality, instead of presenting absolute knowledge, different perspectives are questioned. The most striking aspect of the Socratic method is its acceptance of unanswered questions. At the end of many dialogues, the concept's meaning is not explained. This shows that philosophy is not finished, but an endless journey. For Socrates, trying to understand a concept is more valuable than defining it. According to him, the real danger is blindly believing in wrongly defined concepts, accepting them without questioning. The effects of the Socratic method are still felt today. In educational systems, critical thinking courses are modeled after this method. In therapeutic processes, especially used in philosophical counseling. In leadership training, a questioning approach is encouraged when making decisions. In media and law, it has become a model for reaching information through questions. Socrates' method offers a way of life that is not bound by any ideology, encouraging the individual to communicate openly with themselves and their surroundings. For Socrates, questioning was not just a method of discussion, but a way of life. He lived this way in his daily life, talking with the same seriousness to everyone from children to soldiers, from philosophers to shoemakers. According to him, everyone had unanswered questions and distorted beliefs within them. Confronting these was possible only with an open mind and courage. Socrates versus the Sophists. The word sophist is derived from the Greek word sophia, meaning wisdom. While initially used to mean wise person, it gradually acquired a different meaning. In the 5th century BCE in Athens, sophists emerged as intellectuals interested in philosophy, who also taught knowledge and rhetoric. They provided education to young people for a fee, particularly aiming to equip them with the skills necessary to succeed in the political arena. The main goal of the Sophists was to teach persuasion on the path to power. Therefore, rhetoric, the art of effective speaking, was their area of expertise. Sophist thought. The intellectual structure of the Sophists developed in accordance with the needs of their time. As ancient Greek society began to democratize, the ability of individuals to persuade public opinion gained great importance. The Sophists promised to teach this skill. Key Sophist ideas included relativism, Protagoras' statement, "Man is the measure of all things," expresses that understanding of truth can vary from person to person. Rhetoric is primary. Persuasiveness, not truth, is important. The goal is to convince the other party. Distinction between nature and law. According to Sophists, people may be equal by nature but are separated by laws. This gives rise to inequalities in society. These ideas brought a critical approach to the social structure of the time. However, this approach was thought to lack a moral foundation. Similarities between Socrates and the Sophists. There are some similarities between Socrates and the Sophists. This is why they were sometimes confused by the public. For example, both practiced philosophy in the streets. Both spoke with and influenced young people. Both were critical of traditional beliefs. Both were questioning and innovative. However, these similarities are superficial. Socrates' purpose and method differed radically from the Sophists. Key differences between Socrates and the Sophists. Understanding of knowledge. Sophists argued that knowledge is relative. Knowledge can change according to each individual's perspective. Socrates pursued knowledge but did not claim to possess it. He made acceptance of ignorance a prerequisite for reaching knowledge. Method of teaching. Sophists taught for a fee, transmitting knowledge. Socrates took no money, midwifed knowledge. Through the Socratic method, he enabled the student to question their own thoughts. Moral stance. Sophists argued that morality is relative and can be shaped by personal or societal interests. Socrates believed that morality has a universal foundation. Virtue is linked to knowledge and can be learned. Understanding of rhetoric. Sophists saw effective speaking as more important than truth. Socrates criticized rhetoric. According to him, speech should serve to reveal the truth. Plato's work, Protagoras, which features a dialogue between Socrates and the famous sophist Protagoras, highlights this philosophical distinction. Socrates questions Protagoras' answers to the question, "Can virtue be taught?" In this work, Socrates' patient, meaning-seeking, and contradiction-revealing style contrasts with Protagoras' constantly shifting, agile, but superficial approach. In this dialogue, Socrates questions the sophists' all-knowing demeanor and ultimately shows their inconsistency to the audience. Socrates' criticism of the sophists. Socrates believed that the sophists were corrupting both philosophy and society. Some of his criticisms include, they turned philosophy into a trade. They aimed to persuade, not to reveal truth. They did not provide moral guidance, only technical skills. They fostered selfishness and ambition for success. Public confusion. Socrates, also considered a sophist. In the eyes of the Athenian public, Socrates was sometimes lumped together with the sophists. Especially in Aristophanes' play, The Clouds, Socrates is depicted as a sophist who corrupts the youth and produces strange ideas. This misunderstanding played a significant role in Socrates' trial. He was, in fact, the one who criticized the sophists most harshly. But this distinction was not always clearly understood by the public. The end of the sophists. Socrates' tragedy. The sophist movement gradually lost public trust, and its influence declined. However, during this process, Socrates being perceived as an extension of them was one of the reasons that prepared his end. Socrates, despite not being a sophist, was accused of thinking like a sophist and making young people questioning. This paved the way for his trial and death sentence. Sophist Socrates' distinction today. In modern philosophy, some of the sophists' ideas, especially in the context of rhetoric and critical thinking, are valued, but Socrates' stance is generally considered more reputable. Socrates is seen as a thinker in pursuit of truth. Sophists are regarded as masters of leaving an impression. This distinction is still valid today. Socratic thought, depth, moral consistency, questioning. Sophist approach, formalism, success-oriented, persuasive skill. Socrates' philosophy. Socrates' philosophy, in direct contrast to the cosmic and physical order interests of the natural philosophers, was directed towards the inner world of man. For him, the most fundamental task of philosophy was not to understand the universe, but to understand humanity. Based on the principle of know thyself, he focused on the individual's development as a moral being. In this context, the health of the human soul, the attainment of knowledge, virtuous living, and well-being were at the center of his thought. Know thyself, perhaps Socrates' most fundamental advice. According to Socrates, knowing oneself is not merely psychological introspection, but also a moral and intellectual process. Possessing knowledge includes gaining awareness not only of the external world, but also of the structure and values of the soul, knowledge and ignorance. According to Socrates, true knowledge is the pure and rational knowledge that one reaches by being purified from subjective opinions, cultural habits, and established societal beliefs. However, the first step to reaching this knowledge is to be aware of one's ignorance. The wisest person is the one who knows that they know nothing. This view forms the basis of philosophical humility. Socrates, by admitting his own ignorance, invites others to think on the path to knowledge. He believes in continuous questioning, not in authority, traditions, or popular opinions. Relationship between knowledge and virtue. According to Socrates, being virtuous depends on knowledge. Someone who acts badly does so not knowingly, but out of ignorance, because if a person knew what was right, they would have no other option but to act on that right. No one does evil willingly. This understanding makes moral behavior a knowledge-based necessity rather than a choice. If a person learns goodness, they cannot act badly. Therefore, education is seen as a moral development process. Understanding of virtue, arete. In ancient Greek, arete meant not only moral goodness, but also the perfect functioning of something in accordance with its nature. For example, the arete of an eye is good vision. The arete of a human being is to think correctly, act correctly, and develop their soul. According to Socrates, virtue is acquired through knowledge. Virtue is a whole. Courage, wisdom, moderation, and justice are inseparable parts. A virtuous life is a healthy soul. Virtue is something that can be learned, and everyone can attain it. However, one can only achieve this through questioning and inner awareness. The foundation of morality, universality, and rationality. Socrates' understanding of morality is based on a search for universal ethics. According to him, morality cannot be reduced to personal beliefs or societal traditions. Moral values must be grounded in reason and based on principles valid for everyone. This approach clearly distinguishes him from his contemporary sophists. While the sophists saw morality as relative, Socrates pursued universal truths. Moral behavior is based on the guidance of reason, not on the arbitrary decisions of the individual. Socrates' understanding of the soul. According to Socrates, man is not only a bodily being but also possesses a soul. The soul represents the moral aspect of man, his intellectual capacity, and his inner world. The body is temporary, but the soul is permanent and open to development. For the soul to develop, to acquire knowledge, to question, to live virtuously, to embrace justice and moderation. Neglecting the soul, according to Socrates, is the greatest disaster that can befall a person, because the corruption of the soul leads to far more dire consequences than physical harm. Understanding of happiness, eudaimonia. Socrates does not define happiness through pleasure or gratification. According to him, true happiness is living with a virtuous soul and constantly developing oneself. This understanding is shaped through the concept of eudaimonia. The unexamined life is not worth living. This statement reveals what kind of moral framework he proposes, both individually and socially. Happiness depends not so much on external circumstances as on the individual's inner state and conscious choices. Socrates' understanding of God and belief. Socrates has a different understanding of God than the popular religion. Beyond the polytheistic Greek belief system, he approaches a more abstract, universal idea of God. He associates the divine with the order of reason and universal moral principles. Therefore, his understanding of God contradicted traditional beliefs and ultimately led to one of the accusations that caused him to be tried. Socrates often claimed to act according to a divine voice or inner intuition called his daimonion. This is interpreted as an inner guide representing his conscience or divine reason. Views on politics and society. Socrates' political views clashed with the democracy of his time. He did not trust the wisdom of the majority. He argued that rulers should be chosen not by the people, but by wisdom and virtue. This strained his relationship with the public. In many dialogues, Socrates emphasizes that laws are corrupted by personal interests, politicians lack virtue, and society's understanding of justice rests on shaky foundations. Therefore, Socrates criticized the structure of society, but adopted the role of a moral reformer rather than a revolutionary. Death in Socrates' philosophy. Socrates saw death not as an end, but as a transition. According to him, for a person who lives a virtuous life, death is nothing to be feared. This is why when he was condemned to death in court, he submitted to the verdict and refused to escape. We should care not about living, but about living well. An unexamined life is not worth living. These thoughts explain his calm and consistent stance in the face of death. Socrates' philosophical influence. Socrates' philosophy influenced not only his own era, but all subsequent history of philosophy. Especially, Plato systematized Socrates' ideas, developing idealism and theories of knowledge. Aristotle adopted Socrates' ethical understanding and transformed it into a systematic moral philosophy. Stoics inherited his thoughts on the purification of the soul and virtue. Modern philosophy, many thinkers from Descartes to Kant, were influenced by Socrates' idea of knowledge and self-awareness. Socrates' political stance and social critique. Socrates was not a direct defender of Athenian democracy. According to him, although democracy was based on the will of the majority, the participation of unwise people in governance could lead society to disaster. With this view, he questioned both the democratic order of the time and the way the people chose their rulers. Democracy is the rule of the ignorant majority. While this statement is not directly attributable to Socrates, it summarizes his attitude. According to Socrates, state governance should not be carried out by randomly selected individuals, but under the guidance of moral and knowledgeable people. This idea would later form the basis for Plato's ideal of the philosopher king. Governance as expertise. Socrates believed that governance, like any other craft, was a matter of expertise. Just as a ship's captain should be chosen based on knowledge and experience, the leaders of a society should be equipped with knowledge and virtue. Therefore, he firmly rejected the people choosing leaders based solely on criteria such as popularity or wealth. Are we to steer a ship by the votes of the crew or entrust it to an experienced captain? This rhetorical question is the essence of his critical approach to the concept of popular will. Obedience to laws. Although Socrates criticized the governance of his time, he saw obedience to the state's laws as a moral obligation. According to him, what maintains order in a society are the laws and the respect shown for these laws. In this context, Socrates preferred to die rather than break the laws, even when he suffered injustice. This stance is particularly evident in the Crito dialogue. When his student Crito suggests a plan for Socrates to escape, Socrates says, "The state brought me up, educated me, protected me. Now I cannot turn my back on it because it has made a decision I dislike." Here, Socrates draws attention to the balance between individual rights and the social contract. Being a member of a society requires accepting the rules of that society. The antithesis of the sophists. A significant element shaping Socrates' political and moral thoughts was his opposition to the sophists. The sophists, with their relativistic understanding of knowledge and moral relativism, were one of the popular intellectual movements of the time. According to them, each individual's truth was their own, and it was sufficient to use the art of persuasion, rhetoric, to achieve success. Socrates, on the other hand, believed in the existence of universal truths and virtue. According to him, the sophists filled people's minds not with knowledge, but with word games. "I do not teach, I only help others give birth to their ideas." One of Socrates' most important defenses against the sophists. He was after dialectic, not rhetoric. The way to truth was not word trickery, but logical questioning and reasoning. The issue of influencing the youth. Socrates' influence, particularly on the youth, became one of the main justifications for his accusers. His encouraging young people to question the existing order led aristocratic families' children, in particular, to develop a skeptical attitude towards traditional values. One of the most striking examples is Socrates' student Alcibiades. Alcibiades, a clever but ambitious young man, entered Athenian politics and at times collaborated with the enemy, earning the hatred of the public. This situation caused the public to view Socrates as a corrupting and dangerous teacher. Similarly, Critias, another student, became one of the leading figures of the 30 tyrants. This further eroded public trust in Socrates. Socrates responded to these accusations as follows: "I am not a teacher. I only ask questions. I am not responsible for the young men who find their own thoughts." However, this defense did not prevent his death. Political atmosphere before the trial. Socrates' trial reflects a process in which he was evaluated not only as a philosophical figure, but also as a political one. After the Peloponnesian War, unrest, distrust, and searching prevailed in Athens. Supporters of democracy were seeking revenge from the period of tyranny, while society was also trying to preserve its traditional values. In this environment, Socrates was accused of not believing in the gods, corrupting the youth, inventing new gods. These accusations were a result of this political climate. His emphasis on individual freedom, questioning, and moral consistency was perceived as a threat, especially in conservative circles. The path to the death sentence. Socrates' trial was more like the trial of a philosophy than an ordinary criminal proceeding. Defending himself before a jury of 501, Socrates delivered a speech that was far from humble and full of irony. He did not accept the charges. On the contrary, he argued that he served Athens and was the city's moral conscience. "I am a gadfly. You are a sleeping horse. I sting to awaken you." This statement summarizes his courageous and humorous defense. Ultimately, the jury found him guilty. His sentence was death. His students wanted to help him escape, but he said, "To disobey the laws would be to betray my principles." And so he drank the hemlock himself. As a figure who defied authority, defended his beliefs to the end, and never deviated from his values despite public anger, he made his mark on history. After his death, the public felt regret. The judges and the trial process were questioned, and his name was glorified. Socrates' legacy. Socrates' death sentence in 399 BCE was not merely an individual tragedy, but a turning point for Athenian society and Greek philosophy. The Athenian populace, which initially felt anger and distrust towards him, gradually replaced these feelings with regret and respect. Socrates began to be remembered as a moral hero and a martyr. In a philosophical sense, Socrates' death highlighted the importance of questioning, criticism, and the free discussion of knowledge. This event underlined that philosophy is not just an academic pursuit, but also a social and ethical responsibility. Plato, by keeping Socrates' life, ideas, and especially his death alive in his works, made him a central figure in philosophy. Plato's founding of the Academy in Athens institutionalized philosophy, and Socrates' ideas continued to be passed down through generations. In this academy, Socrates' methods were systematically taught and developed. Socrates' ideas were rediscovered during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Modern philosophy continued to draw on his themes of rationalism, ethical inquiry, and individual conscience. Philosophers like Kant, Hegel, and Nietzsche interpreted Socrates' legacy in different ways, some praising him as the founder of rationalism and ethical consciousness, while others evaluated him from a critical perspective. In conclusion, Socrates remains one of the most discussed figures in the world of philosophy today, and one about whom the most works have been written. He continues to live on in academic studies, educational philosophies, legal and political theories, and works of art.